New Relic being sort of my go-to for everything for APM. SolarWinds was a big infrastructure monitoring play for me. Obviously, the breach affected my thought process as well as my peers. And then, Splunk is sort of everything. It's not necessarily an APM. It's really the Swiss Army knife of IT. So it's your log aggregation. It's find that needle in a haystack. So it does a number of things, but I wouldn't necessarily say I would use it just for APM. I do see Datadog as very strong market play. I see them as really growing the business substantially, and maybe something that I keep my eye on as contracts come up for renewal.
That's fantastic, Jason. I'm afraid after that answer, I might be calling on you a little bit too much, but I'm going to open it up to the rest of the group. Marv, haven't heard from you in a little bit. Anything on this slide that you particularly want to comment on? We're going to get in a little bit more on the log management and the other functions on the next two slides, but particularly here on the APM and database monitoring side, sir.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I actually had something interesting on the previous, but just going to this one of the things I've observed is, especially if you're dealing in a very large, not just national, but say even global company in a sense, there's a lot of decentralization that goes on, and each little group occasionally has its own favorites for different reasons. So really, it isn't so much only about what a vendor gives, it's also how much somebody's got invested into that vendor and what they're doing. And like was mentioned, Splunk is a do-all there, and what you find is because it's do-all, it's also have more. You have to put into it work, effort, and things to make it work well, and especially if you want to get integrated with other tools to give you a full holistic picture, whereas the other ones have a somewhat more narrow focus at times. And in the end, the clients worry about how much they've got invested. So if they've got some real experts there and so on, of course, they're going to go play with it because they've used it a lot. When it comes to other things like Dynatrace, yes, there's a way of, for example, integrating Dynatrace into, say, AWS by setting up the AWS monitoring and then having Dynatrace hook into it, of course, but that means you're still relying underneath on some of the cloud monitoring. And what happens as people move to the cloud, obviously they're going to look at the tools they're first given from the vendor and then look at individual, standalone vendors like a Datadog, Dynatrace, whatever. And what you're going to find is those vendors that can give you a lot better information and a lot more of a good integrated view of your entire environment, both what you may have on-prem as well as the cloud together. Those are the ones that succeed and grow and do really the best and so on. So Dynatrace is pretty good. It's interesting. It's that high. Grafana is an interesting thing if you're really interested in some graphic stuff and measurement stuff in a certain way. So I think it's more of a niche thing. SolarWinds, you hit it right on the head there and so on. I know almost every financial company I ever dealt with always had some of it there. They haven't ripped it out entirely, but they're very much more suspicious and put a real almost a pseudo network around it to protect in a sense. But my gut tells me that there could be other attacks coming of other things. So let's not get into that area of security.
And when we get to the network monitoring side, I think all of us are going to be surprised what SolarWinds, how high it still is.
Yes.
And just to all the panelists out there, no one's here to listen to me speak. Marv, to your point, if you had something interesting to say, please interject. No, nobody wants to hear me. If there was something quickly you wanted to say about the pricing model, I'd be happy to go back for you.
Yeah, the real quick there is there are actually two types of user-based pricing is that depending on which vendors you have and what they offer. And one is the standard subscription-based, a user subscribes and so on, but there's also a user usage-based. You might think of it as sort of somewhere like an ingestion thing, but it's not a global, it's on a user base. And what some people like is that can actually give you some sort of price assistance and lowering things depending on how you deal with your users. And I try to think of, say, a third-party company that's offering this service to some sense, and they have many clients and they want to be able to bill each client and see how they're doing it individually. And what I've noticed about it is as companies have gone into the cloud, it's very simple that they like the host base because it's much more predictable. But as they start building up the observability and seeing not only how apps are running, but what they're doing and how much they're using, they really realize that different models can help them. And in the decentralized environment that I'm currently in, different pieces of the organization actually use different parts of it. Some of it is political. Some of them will use, say, host-based because they can predict it a little better and, you know, have it set for their budget, which is silly, but it works for them and they're happy with it, not necessarily the most efficient, whereas others are very, very efficient conscious. So it's not always a one size fits all, even within one large company. For medium, smaller companies, obviously that may not be the case.
Yeah, understood. And not only the pricing, but it's also very clear to us that it's not a one size fit all from a vendor perspective, which we'll get into. Kurt, I'm going to ask you on this side. Also, I'm going to move on a little bit here to, you know what, let's stick with APM and database one more time, Kurt, so you get a chance to take a look at this before we move on. But as you take a look at this, are you surprised at how pervasive the cloud is? And what are your thoughts about some of the more niche independent providers and how they're performing here?
So I think, you know, like it was said a few times, and Marvin original statement was exactly right, is that it varies, right? I think when I look at, for example, like this, I mean, the pervasiveness of the cloud ones, we have some of the cloud ones, and I see these more almost generational in a sense, right? So the other thing too is because of the way our enterprise is by way of multiple acquisitions. So again, the decentralized, we come from different families, what have you. So we have these products, and also by different groups. So we have Dynatrace out there. They tend to be, I don't want to use negatively term, but legacy kind of applications, what have you. We see some new development ones that are like AppD that prefer some of the openness aspects, and there's some preference there. The cloud ones are, of course, almost like born in the cloud, so to speak, application services, and part of that is because they initially started off with kind of their own support, monitoring application support teams, and then kind of moved in there. So we got to centralize these, and this is where the strategy comes into big play. Is what is the organization strategy around these? But at the end of the day, we see the cloud ones being the native services. They tend to be, again, I think shown on the other graphs, they're easier to deploy and easier to use because they're quite frankly tame to that. But the things like a Datadog, which is interesting there, is like, look, at the end of the day, we've got to look across the board. We can't afford to have different teams, separate teams, what have you, right? How do we enforce policies, quite frankly, things like that. Hence why Splunk is for security and SIM and all that, or SIEM, depending on how to say it, is really kind of key because you want to centralize around that. But then when you want to apply this to these other environments, sure, you can do it. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? So that, or
I
just,
appreciate that very much. This one is going into infrastructure monitoring. And again, I just wanted to highlight again, the cloud are the strongest on the infrastructure monitoring as represented in gray. SolarWinds as an independent is also large, and Splunk also there as well in the infrastructure monitoring side. Log management as shown on the blue, as was mentioned earlier, Splunk is by far the largest. But again, AWS CloudWatch is the second here. So, you know, very interesting. I'm going to ask a submitted question here and make it a jump ball. Somebody pointed out in this survey that one of the most interesting trends they saw was that there is no singular observability tool out there that does everything. That's very clear based on this survey input. We're kind of curious, what would need to happen for one of these vendors to be a unifying force, or is it just impossible entirely? But I'm just curious for you guys, would it be pricing? Would it be efficacy? What would it take for one or two of these to really be a unifying force? Or as you consider, you know, going forward, is it going to be multiple vendors that you have to manage to do this? Jason, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think the initial thought is that SolarWinds is probably the closest in the marketplace to having everything in there. With that being said, I think that that's now a complete 180, right, and that's not a viable solution for them or for most people in the marketplace due to what happened. I think you really need to have a solution that focuses on APM, that focuses on network monitoring, log aggregation, really an alert process under a single dashboard. And nobody's really been able to accomplish that successfully so far. You have the cloud providers, they're obviously focused on their cloud and not on multi-cloud or hybrid modes as much. So this ends up being a challenge with that. And then you sort of have these evolving players like Datadog, which really started as one thing and is now growing into a lot of different things. And, you know, Splunk as well. I think Splunk missed on a really good opportunity to take over this space because everybody has it for one reason or another. They could have easily added the components that were needed into the product to succeed, and they sort of dropped the ball on that. So it's a very crowded field. I think that some consolidation would make this happen rapidly in the marketplace. And I'm looking forward to seeing that shortly, because there's a lot of players in the space.
I was going to open up the Q&A before, but I had the same thought. Somebody just opened up in the Q&A box. Given that we'd mentioned SolarWinds a couple of times, is there anything they can do to kind of reclaim that position in the industry, Jason, or to anyone else? I'm sure most of you have utilized it. What can they do to shake off the stigma of the breach?
It's the value jet of the APM industry. So you have to reinvent yourself. You can't be the same product, because the stigma that a company that you use to monitor for anomalies gets breached is not something that you can overcome. It's not like, sure, you hear a lot of retailers get breached. At first, it was a lot more publicized than it is right now. Now it's sort of like this is more of a regular occurrence. I don't think that under their existing name, they can save themselves. I think what they need to do is they need to either merge with somebody else, or they need to acquire somebody else and then consolidate into that platform. That gives them a footprint in the marketplace with the existing install base, but it also changes the direction of the company. And I think that's what they desperately need right now.
Okay, great. And just quickly, just showing the visual that also in network monitoring, they lead. So network and infrastructure seems to be where a lot of people haven't lifted and shifted yet with SolarWinds. But on the other aspects, clearly, to your point, Jason, they're the kind of falling behind on that side. Opening up to Michael on your thoughts, not particularly to just the SolarWinds, and if we're getting a lot of questions, I promise everyone, I'm going to leave the last 15 minutes to all of these vendor specific. But real quickly, Michael, when you take a look at this on the network monitoring, and then we're going to go into the security monitoring for you, sir. Your thoughts on the breakdown on how these are playing out?
Yeah, definitely not a surprise. A great example is pre-supply chain that we just got done talking about the risks and the challenges for SolarWinds as a company. We were a SolarWinds customer that had migrated to Datadog. So we adopted Datadog pre-supply chain attack by a couple of years. So we were an early adopter of Datadog. We find it as very much don't mean to speak in hyperbole, but a bit of a disruptor in the space. Notably, at the time we adopted Datadog, it was for just infrastructure and data center monitoring, and seemingly every day or every other day when I go to log in, there seems to be a new function or platform that Datadog adds to its portfolio. But with that said, we still use SolarWinds for some of our network monitoring. So that statistic is definitely not surprising to me. It definitely speaks to the the habits of technologists who just want to continue to use what they learned and what served them well, even when the marketplace is shifting away from them, or there is earth-shattering challenges like the SolarWinds attack. That I do agree with my colleague that from SolarWinds' perspective, the sustainability is only going to come from reinventing themselves. We're not going to be able to move the royal we, too far and too quickly away from them, fast enough away from them until they refocus and recenter themselves. And that could include rebranding to get away from that stigma. But with that said, infrastructure services commonly very slow to move. And I think that's represented there in that chart. And definitely, like I said, my own experience where we've moved in the last few years to Datadog. We also adopted AppD for APM. We kept Splunk in place for security and log aggregation and some BI aggregation we're doing, but still maintain that legacy SolarWinds environment.